All right, sorry about the technical difficulties. Looks like we'll probably have about 2 videos for this. For some reason, my system's not working very well. But we're going on to now. We're going on to the atomic bomb. So in 1945, the end of the war basically was caused by atomic weapons. Powerful weapons dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Harry Truman, who was the president after Roosevelt passed away, made the decision to go ahead and drop the bombs. Now, it was a very controversial decision, and it ended World War II, but the loss of life to civilians was catastrophic, and so there's always a question on, will this be an issue, or was it an issue? Thank you. You too. All right. So sorry about that. So we had a little bit of interruptions on this, so I apologize, but I'll do it on a different day next week. But basically, once again, going back to atomic bomb, we did have issues with the thought process of, was it a humane thing to do? Some of the thought process behind it was the fact that we actually saved more lives by dropping it, because Japan was not, with their culture, they were not going to give up easily. And there could have been a lot more death involved if we actually attacked the island. So the war in Europe, basically we talk about the war in Europe, and the war in Europe is talks about all the space that basically Germany took over. So Germany took over. On the east of him was Russia. On the west of him was basically all of Europe, going all the way to the coast towards France. And basically Germany occupied all of Western Europe. And so in order for us to combat him, we had to get onto European soil. And so that happened actually on D-Day. So this was the day that the American troops, Australian troops, Canadian troops landed on French soil and started our way to Germany to fight and contain Hitler. We also talk here next is about the Holocaust, and what we know about the Holocaust. It was a mass murder of 6 million Jews. Now, it wasn't just Jews that were murdered. They had other people of the population that was murdered. Could be people who basically had special needs. It could be gypsies. It could be certain religions. And so it could be a lot of Russians that were captured, were murdered in some of these camps. So you had a lot of different people who were murdered, but they were actually trying to get rid of all the people, all the Jewish population in Europe. And so the Holocaust represents that fact. Now, it was at this particular time starting to become a two-front war. And all that means was Germany was fighting British and America from the west and Russia to the east. So Germany had to divide their armies into two to try to gain advantage in Europe. But the problem with that is that if you're fighting on two fronts and you're fighting multiple countries are going to end up probably having more resources and people than you. So once Germany went to a two-front war, the odds were against them. And so they got a little bit too greedy for what they wanted to do. If they would have just probably went after Great Britain and left Russia alone, they could have possibly taken over Europe. It doesn't mean that they would have kept it, but the outcome of some of the things could have went a different way. And so fortunately for us, they did align with Japan, and they started a two-front war. We actually were attacking France, and that made it so that we could stop the war, and the war didn't go any longer than it did, because like I said earlier, it was 60 million people who actually died. We talked about the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. They had many battles that were part of There are many battles that were part of the war. One of the big was Battle of the Bulge. This was, it was named this because if you looked on a map and how Germany attacked the Allies, was basically, they put a bulge in the line. They attacked a particular line of Americans, which was a very long line. When I say line, this is just where the Americans were from a defensive or offensive standpoint. And they tried to go right in the middle and break the line. And so the bulge was them trying to break the line. It was the last major German offensive in Europe. German forces in surprise attack pushed through U.S. forces through the Ardennes, which was a mountainous region in Belgium. It postponed some things for a short period of time, but it ultimately failed. When we talk about Germany as a whole, even though the Americans were going after Hitler, basically we did not go into Berlin. And Berlin was the capital of Germany, and that's where Hitler actually was. We allowed the Soviets to actually capture Berlin. It was a pretty bad battle. There was about 1 million people who actually died just trying to take this city between both Germany and Russia. So it was very brutal. It happened in the spring of 1945. Rather than Hitler being captured, because he didn't want to be captured because he thought he'd either be tortured or whatever the case may be, he committed suicide with his newly married wife. So he had a girlfriend or a lady who he was involved with for many years. He married her like the day of his suicide, and then they committed suicide together. This ended the war in Europe, but the war was still going on in Japan for another 4 or 5 months. So even though the war in Europe was over, World War II was still going on, and we were fighting it in the Pacific theater instead of the European theater. Many senior Nazis were convicted in the Nuremberg trials, and so basically they have trials against humanity. And so a lot of the main characters were people who worked in like concentration camps and stuff like that, were tried, and a lot of them actually were hung. And a lot of them were executed because of war crimes. So if you go to war with people, even in today's society, there are consequences. And so you have to keep in mind that some of these consequences can actually mean that you can be punished severely with your life if you are proven that you did something that was against humanity. And a lot of the things revolved around, well, the leaders revolved around just their disregard for life and the murdering of a lot of people. And then a lot of obviously the concentration camps, some of the people were beyond just the normal cruelty, and they were basically killed or executed because of it. Soviets occupied Berlin. Soviets captured Berlin in spring of 1944. We talked about that. The home front. So entering World War II ended the Great Depression. So in the 1930s we had a Great Depression, and basically 25% of the population was out of work. You had people starving, you had food lines, you had all this other stuff. One of the best things can happen to an economy is to go to war, because in a war you have to produce stuff, you have to produce tanks, you have to produce weapons, you have to produce all this stuff, and so you have to have a workforce to do it. So all of a sudden your workforce is going back to work. So the Great Depression helped us the World War II helped us get out of the Great Depression. And so, but you still had things going on that was happening at the home front. Even though America wasn't getting, except for Pearl Harbor, we weren't getting impacted through actual battles or stuff, we still had things that we had to do. One was rationing, and this is just restricting the supply of items used by public during warfare. So basically rationing, like maybe you ration tin or metals, because metals or tin or stuff like that are used for weapons. You do different things. You might ration certain things that is needed elsewhere to help fight the war. Internment of Japanese America. This was a big deal. So when Japan was attacked Pearl Harbor, there was a concern about the loyalty of some of the Japanese Americans, especially on the West Coast, where there was a larger population of it. And so America made a decision that they were going to take over 100,000 of these Japanese Americans, force them to relocate to prison camps. Now, they weren't like the prison camps of Germany, but still, you took away these people's freedom. They had to sell everything they owned within a very short period of time. And basically, at that particular time, they were put in camps until World War II. And the sad part about it was, another part was that some of these Japanese Americans actually went, even though they were put in camps, they went to fight against the Japanese or the Germans in World War II. But this was an embarrassing part of the war for us, because we basically relocated and put our own people in prison camps when it was unnecessary. It was just fear that they were still aligned with people from Japan. And a lot of these Japanese Americans were even born in the United States, so it wasn't something like they were planted over here to be spies. We just did a very wrong thing. And the Double V campaign, African Americans continue to face discrimination at home and pledge to fight for victory over Hitler in Europe and to put an end to racism. So even though, once again, slavery was over, Civil War was fought, African Americans were separated from white Americans in the battles, so that you had African American troops and you had Anglo troops, or whatever the case may be. But even though African Americans had a big part in the war, there was still the discrimination piece that was going on. Obviously, that's something that didn't change much until the 60s when civil rights started, but this was still an ongoing problem. So post-war, 1945 to 1974. So after Roosevelt died before the war, Harry Truman became president, and he was president from 1945 to 1952. They also came out with the GI Bill, and that gave military, federal veterans financial and education benefits. So when you're talking about military these days, like a lot of people will, I'll go in for a couple of years, and when I get out, they'll pay for my school and stuff of that nature. So this GI Bill is something that started right after World War II, that gave the opportunities that you can get today. Whether it could be even financing the home or whatever the case may be, but a lot of it with educational benefits as well. Suburbanization. Many people moved to communities built on the outskirts of major cities known as suburbs. So suburbs started coming into place. We're well aware of them. So in most cases, in the situations, when people lived in cities, everyone lived in the cities. You didn't really have, the suburbs were more or less, didn't really exist. People lived outside the cities, they were usually rich, whatever the case may be. But they started making small towns and outside the cities, and not necessarily a town, but just a place for people to live. And this was suburbs, so because this was all part of the baby boomers. So after war, you had this terrible war going on for years, and then all of a sudden you had all these GIs home. They had opportunity to, with some money on them, the economy was good. They were making houses for them. There was also a baby boom that went on from the period of World War II through the end of World War II to the mid-1960s. We had a very unusual high birth rates. And so a lot was going on in America at this time. Now, after Truman was president, basically Dwight E. Eisenhower became president from 1953 to 1960. And Dwight Eisenhower was actually a general, one of the major generals during World War II. So he was already well known, and he became president. And his biggest opportunity during president was the Red Scare. We've talked about this before, but everyone was afraid of the Cold War at this particular point. We also had the Korean War that took place during this time frame as well. And so there was different things going on. We had the Interstate Highway Act and the authorized building of a national highway system. So all these roads that you're aware of, all these highways like 1604, 281, at one particular time, a lot of this didn't exist. So they had a big project of a Highway Act which raised money and built roads across the United States. Rock and roll, former music that became popular in the 50s. So you had jazz that was popular in the 20s, rock and roll became popular in the 50s. Sometimes it was seen as a rebellion against conformity of the decade. And right there, obviously, is Elvis Presley, one of the leaders of it. After Eisenhower, the next president was John F. Kennedy, 1961 to 1963. This is when we start getting kind of the modern age of politics and the presidential elections. So his first televised presidential debate, Kennedy and Richard Nixon, who later on became president as well, were involved in the first televised debate. Now, Kennedy was very young at the time. He was one of the youngest presidents. He actually one or two, I think he's the second youngest president of all time after Teddy Roosevelt at this particular point. But he was a very young president, and when he came into his presidency, America was feeling good about themselves. And so he brought policies in that would help people help the United States. So it wasn't so much what can the government do for you, what can you do for your country? And so they did programs like the Peace Corps that people would volunteer and they'd address social and international concerns. Another thing that was created during this time period was NASA. So NASA was important because obviously by 1969 we put a man on the moon. And NASA, we were in a space race with Russia because of the fact that they actually got the first satellite, Sputnik, up in the air. We didn't know if someone got to the moon first, what kind of control they could have over the planet. And so we had a space race. Obviously in 1969 we landed on the moon. We're the only country that actually ever did land on the moon. And we did it several times, but that ended the space race. But that was a big deal. So Kennedy said in his term in the early 60s that we'd have someone on the moon by the end of the decade, and he was correct. Now, Kennedy was assassinated. He was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in 1963. And then a Texan, actually, who was his vice president at that time, became president of the United States. And this was Lyndon B. Johnson. It was from 1963 to 1968. And Lyndon B. Johnson believed in rights for a lot of people. He believed in civil rights. And he believed in great societies. LBJ's program that addressed American social problems, including health care, civil rights, and urban decay. So basically, health care has been been on people's mind for obviously years and years, and we're still going through it today. Civil rights, obviously, this was a big time for civil rights during the 60s. A lot of people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X came out of this era. He also wanted a war on poverty. He wanted Americans to basically not, in a country that's so great, why should you have poverty? And we still have it today. We still haven't figured this out, but he was working on this. Some of this stuff he would have probably been able to accomplish more on it, but he was also involved in the Vietnam War, which it took a lot of resources away from other things that he wanted to do. Also, Medicare, federal program provides health insurance to Americans over 65, was formed. Medicaid program provides health insurance for people on welfare. So these are two programs that are going on today. There's the Housing and Urban Development HUD, the federal department responsible for the major housing programs in the U.S. Johnson's civil rights record was a focal point during Johnson administrations, and many laws were passed during his presidency. just a second, looking at a couple things. Okay, so the next thing that we had was Johnson's civil rights record. So basically the things that he tried to work on. And so there was a couple of civil rights things that he did work on. Among many, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination based on race, religion, or national origin in public places illegal. So you couldn't discriminate a person because of their race or their color or whatever the case may be. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated literacy tests for voters. So basically, in order to stop people from voting, especially minorities, they would either charge them or they would basically give them literacy tests that they couldn't pass. A literacy test is like some kind of test on reading or writing or knowledge. And basically that's how they would discriminate and not allow people to vote, was put in these practices. Well, they found that this was unlawful, and in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated that. The 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax, and this was basically, if you wanted to vote, you would have to pay a tax, which was, once again, not how the program was set up, but states were doing this and areas were doing this, so they made sure that this was an amendment on the Constitution, that you did not have to pay money to actually vote in the country. The Civil Rights of 1968 prohibited discrimination, sale, or rental of housing. So prior to this period, if I was a particular ethnic group, I could say, if I'm San Anglo, for instance, I only wanted to rent to Anglo people, then that was some of the procedures in some of the areas. In 1968, that type of profiling or discrimination was no longer allowed. Then we went to Richard Nixon from 1969 to 1974. And Richard Nixon was a long-term politician. He ran against Kennedy. And he basically, but his presidency ended up in turmoil. He basically, 26th Amendment went in effect around that time, giving voter rights to Americans 18 years older, largely due to the fact that 18 years old were eligible for draft during the Vietnam War. So you were actually able to fight for your country, but you couldn't vote for your country. And so that did not seem correct. So the 26th Amendment basically changed the age of voting. Nixon's trip to China. China was a communist country. Going to China was a diplomatic concern, and so he basically had a very successful trip in a lot of Americans' eyes to China at a particular time when China was very different from us in a lot of different ways. They were an actual communist country. The biggest thing that impacted him was the Watergate scandal, and this was a political scandal that occurred in the 70s. And basically the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office were broken into. And Nixon's administration attempted to cover this up. So they broke into this place to try to find information. Nixon's administration was aware of that, and they tried to cover it up. This was a huge scandal, and basically he was going into the impeachment process. Versus going through the impeachment process, he resigned, and Ford was basically made the president, and he, at that particular time, pardoned Nixon. So it was the first time that we've had a president actually resign in office, and it's only happened at this particular time. The Cold War era, 1945 to 1975. And so what was the Cold War? Cold War was basically, after the end of the World War II, there was basically two superpowers. There was Russia and there was the United States. Obviously, Russia had a different policy of governing than we did, and we were concerned that they were going to basically try to turn other countries into communism or whatever the case may be. But then they also got the ability to have nuclear weapons. So Russia and the United States were the only ones with nuclear weapons. And so the Cold Era was so named because the two major powers, each possessing nuclear weapons and thereby threatened with mutually assured destruction. So the one thing we found out about nuclear weapons is once you got to a certain point, it doesn't matter who shot first or whatever the case may be. If you start shooting weapons back at each other, it's like a game of tic-tac-toe. If you know what you're doing in tic-tac-toe, no one ever wins. In a nuclear war, no one ever wins. It's a no-win situation. It's not a deterrent from people because we still fight battles and wars today. But the only time we've ever used nuclear weapons was in World War II. And so we were scared, and they were scared, that we were going to try to, at one point, if it got got so bad that we would actually have in World War III, which would be a nuclear war. So some things that happened during this time period was a Berlin blockade, 1948 to 1949, where basically Russia would not allow for the United States to help out anyone in Berlin. They actually had planes dropping stuff to people because the people were starving, so on and so forth. But they blockaded Berlin, and basically later on they divided the city in half and put up a wall called the Berlin Wall. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, another war that we actually fought in, and Suez Crisis, Berlin Crisis of 1961, Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, and this is where the Russians actually were putting missile silos in Cuba, which Cuba is only a couple hundred miles from Florida. And so if they actually were able to establish a missile station in Cuba, they could attack most of our country in the southern part very instantaneously without us being able to do much. So this is probably, the Cuban Missile Crisis was about 13 days that happened in 1962. And it happened during the Kennedy administration, and it was the closest we've ever come to World War III of nuclear war. Obviously the Vietnam War, which is actually very long, one of the longest wars that we've had. It was one of the first wars that we actually lost. We won the battles, but we lost the war, and it caused a lot of strife in the United States, especially among the general population and young adults. Soviet War in Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989, kind of their Vietnam War, Soviet War in Afghanistan. Basically, the Soviets eventually pulled out after 10 years in Afghanistan, went basically back to ruling themselves, which leads us to 20 years later or 15 years later when we actually attacked Afghanistan. So, some different things that happened. Communism was one of the things that we were concerned about. And in communism, basically, one of the biggest things that is different from us is ownership. Means of production, as well as social, political, and economic ideologies. Basically, the government owns everything. We have a free enterprise system. You have different things in the United States where you can sell the things that you want to. There's not as much government regulation. But in a communist country, basically, the social order is very structured. The government owns everything. The way production is controlled by the government. So you are basically, you have very little rights. You have government owns all property, one political party. Government controls the economy and wealth is distributed equally. So basically, in theory, everyone has the same thing. So you're no longer envious of so-and-so's Mercedes because everyone would have the same type of car or something similar. So the communism is where the government controls just about everything. And the United States is different from that because the federal government is there to oversee and to help and support, but the states have a lot of rights, and obviously we have a constitution that we have a lot of rights. In a situation with communism, a lot of your rights disappear. Now, there isn't a lot of communism, non-communistic countries in the world anymore, but what we have is a capitalistic system, and basically it's based on private ownership of capital goods, media production, so on and so forth. So you're able to do a lot as an individual. You have your own businesses, you have a free enterprise system where you basically can regulate what you want to sell. There's a supply and demand curve with a minimum of government intervention. So that's the important thing, a minimum of government intervention. So in a capitalist system, I can go just start a business tomorrow and sell stuff to eBay. Or I can do this, or I can do whatever the case may be. And unless I am too powerful, which is a monopoly, then the government will only intervene so much. And the only time the government intervenes is when it seems that it's basically taking away from rights of people in the country. So the government can intervene, but in most cases, it's a free enterprise system, meaning you have the ability to do a lot of different things. All right, containment. This goes back to the prevention of communism spreading to other nations. So with the Red Scare and with Russia, we wanted to prevent communism from spreading to one country. So the thought process is if you have one country in the middle of Africa and they went communist, then all the countries around them would eventually go to communism as well. So they had a level of containment, and that's kind of what the Vietnam War was, where we wanted to contain that area and make sure that the South Vietnam didn't become communist because the North Vietnam was communist. So our thought process was that we contain it, we stop it where it goes so it will not spread. The United Nations was formed after World War II, which is still in existence today, serves as a peacekeeper in world conflicts. The Truman Doctrine gave military and economic aid to the countries threatened by communism. So Truman was concerned once again about the spreading of communism. So if a country was being taken over or was being persuaded to go to communism, then the United States could step in either militarily or with money. Marshall Plan proposed by General George Marshall to help European countries rebuild after World War II. You got to keep in mind the Marshall Plan basically, Europe was a disaster. After 5 or 6 years of war, the cities were destroyed, you had no infrastructure. So the Marshall Plan was obviously to how to offer economic aid to these war-torn countries to get them back to where they were able to rule themselves again or have a normal life. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance formed between the U.S., Canada, and 10 Western European countries, and the Warsaw Pact. So this was a mutual defense treaty between communist countries. So you had the Warsaw Pact, which was communism's, and it was a response to NATO, which NATO was more about countries with similar thoughts and philosophies who were non-communist. So now we go to the Berlin Airlift, and we talked about this just briefly a little while ago. But the Berlin Airlift was basically U.S. flew food and supplies into West Berlin after the Soviet Union set up a blockade in 1948. So the West Berlin was controlled, or was supposed to be controlled by the United States and other countries that were non-communist. But there was a blockade in there, and those people were starving, so we actually had airlifts that flew stuff and food and supplies to help the people out. The next thing was the Korean War, was between the Republic of Korea, South Korea supported by the United Nations, North Korea supported by the Republic of China, It was the primary result of political division of Korea by agreement of the victorious allies at the conclusion of the Pacific War at the end of World War II. So basically, World War II line was drawn and in between the country, and basically North Korea was communist, controlled by China. South Korea was supported by the United Nations, and so was democratically backed. And so during the 1950 time period, the North, which was a communist, decided to attack the South and try to unite the country at the 38th parallel. And that's where U.S. military troops ended up getting involved, and we basically started trying to fight back the communist aggressors at this point. And the war went on for about 3.5 years. And what basically happened was it ended up being a stalemate. So we lost Vietnam, which was after this. We tied in Korea because it was a stalemate. Until this day, it is still a stalemate. North Korea is run by one person, a dictatorship, a communist country, and then the South Korea, it's a democracy. The Rosenberg trial. This was an American group accused of communism and helping the Soviet obtain information on the atomic bomb. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. So they were accused of helping the Russia get to be able to have nuclear powers. And they basically were found guilty and were put to death. It was a husband and a wife. Nuclear weapons. In 1952, U.S. successfully detonated the first H-bomb. So basically this was a nuclear bomb, but it was just more powerful than the ones that were dropped on Japan. The ones that were dropped on Japan, even though they killed a lot of people and they were very destructive, had a lot of radiation, the weapons that came after that, as soon as we kind of figured out how atoms and all this stuff works and how nuclear power works, we were able to construct bigger bombs. And so then you had a nuclear arms race. The Rosenbergs gave information to Russia. Russia started making bombs. America and the United States started a nuclear race, which they were competing for supremacy in nuclear warfare or nuclear power. And so this was what basically the Cold War, not only the stopping of communism, but stopping of democracy on whatever side you wanted, but it basically was also about nuclear weapons. Mutual assured destruction doctrine, the use of nuclear weapons will result in the complete destruction of both sides. So once again, this goes back to the theory that no one wins a nuclear battle. Joseph McCartney, senator from Wisconsin, became famous by accusing people of being communists. So there was a lot of stuff that going on in the country at this particular time. So we were scared of communism. We were scared of nuclear war. We had senators who were accusing people of being communist and having hearings, public hearings, which was on the news, that would trying to make people believe that certain people were communists. There was discrimination against that. So there's a lot of interesting things going on during these time periods. Now, also keep in mind there's social unrest in the United States through ethnic groups and minorities. And so you add all this other stuff going on, there was a lot of bad, and there was some good. From an economic standpoint, the country was growing, developing. And so we did have some good stuff come out of it. Sputnik was what kind of started the space race. This was the first man-made satellite to be launched out of space, and obviously, and the Soviet Union did it. And it was a symbolic success for communists. This basically told the United States that we cannot allow to have this happen, and the space race continued. And basically, it was between the United States and Soviet Union, focused on attaining first in space exploration. This went on for most of the 60s, and obviously we were the only ones who ended up being going to the moon, but the space race still continued in other aspects with satellites and so forth. U-2 incident, This was basically spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union prior to satellites. A lot of stuff that's actually out in outer space. We had actually to get photographs of what was going on over the countries by flying planes. And the U-2 was a spy plane that had cameras on it and would take pictures. And so this was a big tension between the USSR and the US. The Berlin Wall, the wall built by the Soviets to separate East and West Berlin. The wall stood until 1989 when communism collapsed. Bay of Pigs, this was a failed invasion of Cuba planned by the US government. The government wanted to have a political entity in there that had more similar to the ideas of the United States. They trained some Cuban exiles. They basically, it ended really bad. It was, most of the battle was in a couple days, and it actually didn't get off to a very good start, and it failed miserably. But the United States was dragged into it because obviously we were behind it. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we talked about already, was the closest we ever came to war. It was a 13-day standoff, and the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba when it was over, and the Soviets removed the missiles. So basically, these are the notes that you need to have for the to fill out the PowerPoint information. So make sure that we are doing this. Hopefully you learned something from it. Sorry about some of the technical difficulties, but if you would basically fill this out, have it to me by next Thursday. I hope that all of you are doing well out there and staying safe, and hope to hear from you soon. If you do need something, text or email me, and make sure, like I said, the grades are just starting now, so these are very important, so make sure you're getting your work done. All right, I appreciate it. Have a good day, and thank you.